Hello, I welcome you all for this session. In this session, we are going to discuss about legacy boot process in a BIOS computer system. Our focus shall mainly be on the BIOS, master boot record, boot loader, boot sequence, kernel, and operating systems. We are going to see into depth what legacy boot is. By legacy boot, we mean the process of booting the computer using BIOS firmware. It stores a list of installed storage devices that are bootable, such as floppy disks, hard drives, optical disk drives, among other types of storage devices, according to a configurable order of priority. So when you power on your computer, the BIOS performs power on self-test, which is known as post. After finishing the post procedure, the firmware loads the first sector of each of the storage target into memory. Then it scans it for a valid MBR. If a valid MBR is found, the firmware passes execution to the bootloader to select a partition to boot from. If one is not found, then it proceeds to the next device in the order set accordingly. So in the next slides, we are going to look into detail what MBR is, what BIOS is, what boot order is, what bootloader is, and what an OS is. So when we talk about BIOS, we mean basic input-output system. BIOS is simply a program which is stored in a non-volatile memory like ROM, which is read-only memory, or flash memory that allows you to set up and access your computer system at the greatest basic level. So BIOS, being a program, provides a set of instructions, and it is responsible for booting up the computer. The BIOS performs all the tests needed at startup time. When it is checked that all boot devices are properly working, BIOS has the work, and the work is to load the operating system. These tests are collectively known as power on self tests. So from the time you power on your computer up to the time the operating system is loaded into your computer, the process is called power on self test. So the computer contains hardware. Among the hardwares we have keyboard, we have monitors, we have disk drivers, and among others. So there are different functions, and these hardware functions require interfacing with the operating system. So BIOS provides drivers for the basic hardwares like keyboard, mouse, monitor. These are basic hardwares because they are needed for our computer to function. So it is found on the motherboards. BIOS is found on the motherboards of the different computers, and it is just a pre-installed program on Windows based on computers that executes when a computer is powered up. So before an operating system, which is the OS, is loaded, the CPU has to access the BIOS. So the main function of BIOS is to set up hardware and start an operating system, and it contains generic code that is needed to control display screens, the keyboard, the mouse, the monitor, and other functions. So the users run the BIOS setup program during the installation of the system and put in the correct parameters. So in the next slides, we are going to see what we get when we access the BIOS setup. The files are contained by any piece of hardware that is needed for a computer to start up. This piece of hardware is also known as boot device. So here, when we go into our BIOS, for this session, I'm going to use HP ProBook 4530 series. So to enter the BIOS of this computer, you press F10 immediately after powering on the computer. Before the HP logo appears on the screen, you continuously press F10 and it brings you into the BIOS. Under the BIOS, we have three different settings. We have file, we have security, we have system configuration. Under files, we have system information. You can have access to the system information, like if you want to know the details about the machine that you have, you go to BIOS and then hit system information. There you'll get all the details about the machine. You can update BIOS from the file. You can set the system date and time from the BIOS, that's under the file. You can reset BIOS security to the factory default, and you can restore default. All these are found under file in BIOS. Then let us explore the security. Under security, you can get different functionalities like setting up BIOS administrator password, setting system management command. You can get user tools, you can get utilities. Under system configuration, you get settings like fast boot, CD-ROM tool, boot sequence, UEFI boot mode. You can get USB device boot and several other settings. All those are found in the BIOS of the computer. Now, after looking at BIOS, remember in the Leagcy boot process, we talked of BIOS, we talked of MBR, which is master boot record. Now let's get to know something about master boot record. Master boot record, which is also known as MBR, is placed in the first sector of the hard disk in the partition table, and that partition table is with a particular function. Like when the computer starts up, BIOS checks the bootloader present in the master boot record, which is present in the first sector of the hard drive. We shall get to see this in the drawing that I've attached to these slides. So the bootloader then loads the operating system into the main memory. The process is known as booting. So in the partition table, when the BIOS accesses the MBR, you know MBR has partition table, and in the partition table we get the disk structures, which is divided into file systems, and partition sizes are all included into the partition table. So to identify the disk from several disks, the operating system uses disk signature, and this signature is normally provided by the MBR. So the disk holds the data that the computer's BIOS requires in finding the operating system and to start the boot process. So MBR is highly needed to start the computer. So in this table, as you can see here, we have MBR. Here we have MBR, and here we have several other partitions, as we can see. And in this MBR we have partition table. So in the disk, in the various partitions, we can store different information like the boot block, the volume control block, file control block, root directory, free space management. These are now where in the several partitions you can decide to put in your files according to how you want it to be and where you want it to be. So we are going to look at the features of master boot record. One, it has a feature of boot loading capability, because you know in the MBR the bootloader code is present, and the bootloader helps to load the operating system into the main memory. And this is by a process called booting process. So ease of use. MBR also makes it very easy for the users, which makes them to manage and maintain their disk partition. Disk identification is another feature of MBR. So to recognize the disk, MBR uses disk signature, like we saw in the other slide. We have several partitions, and each partition has a signature with which it can easily be identified. So compatibility. MBR is the majority of operating systems, including Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, as well as the wide variety of devices, uses master boot record. Actually, whenever you're installing your Windows, you'll find that master boot record is compatible with most of the technologies, both recent and the ancient technologies. So we are coming to look at bootloader. So bootloader is a software program that is responsible for actually loading the operating system once the boot manager has finished its work. And by loading operating systems, we mean loading the kernel of the operating system. So bootloader is typically part of the operating system itself. Till this point, bootloader starts loading the bootloader starts loading the OS, there is nothing in the main memory of the machine. So bootloader has some tasks that we expect it to do. One is loading and passing the boot configuration file. 2 is loading and initializing OS kernel into the main memory. 3, loading and initializing the other system components and the drivers. And finally, it finishes up the system environment setup and transfer the control to the kernel. So we have boot sequence. Boot sequence is the order of storage devices that the computer will try to boot from. For example, if I'm using a flash drive, it is in this boot sequence that I'm going to prioritize that whenever I'm booting my computer, I can make my USB flash to come number 1, that is USB drive, or I can say no, let it be number 2, okay, let it be the last. So it depends on which device you give priority to. So in most situations, it's only important when you are first installing an operating system onto the computer, as you'll want to boot from a given device. And if you have 2 hard drives with 2 different OS, you need to choose which one you boot into, and this is done under boot sequence. So how does boot sequence work? So when you turn on the computer, the system first searches the CPU, which is the main brain of the computer, and it is in the CPU where all the boot drivers and other drivers are located, and then it loads them from the secondary memory into the primary memory. After loading it into the primary memory, it searches the whole computer installed drivers where the operating system is installed. Then it loads it up, and if it does not find any operating system, it gives the user the error that no operating system is installed or no bootable device is found. So it is advisable to insert a bootable device and restart your computer. So after successfully finding all the drivers and the operating system, the computer loads the operating system and starts the booting sequence. So we have been talking about kernel. Kernel is the core component of an operating system that acts as a bridge between the hardware and software. It manages system resources such as memory, CPU, input-output devices, and provides a layer of abstraction between the hardware and high-level software components. So it is here that you find kernel is actually the one linking the user and the computer, because most times we shall not be able, or we may not be able, to understand the machine language. So kernel here serves as a bridge between the user and the computer. So kernels are of different types. We have monolithic kernel, microkernel, hybrid kernel, nanokernel, and exokernel. So it is the computer program that first loads on startup, and once it is loaded, it manages the remaining startups. It also manages memory, peripheral, input-output requests from software. Moreover, it translates all the input-output requests into data processing instruction for the CPU, and it also manages other tasks such as memory management, task management, disk management, file management, mention them. So, like we have been saying, kernel is a bridge between the user and the hardware. So we can illustrate it here. We see how it is connecting the user to the software. Like the user can access the memory, the user can access other devices through the kernel. It links it to the machine, to the processor, and gives the memory. So it is a very great deal in computing technology, the special operating system. So we have been talking about operating system. So let's get into knowing what operating system is. An operating system is a software that manages computer hardware. It can also be defined as the program running at all times on the computer. So, operating system is concerned with the allocation of resources and services such as memory, processor, devices, files, and information. The operating system correspondingly includes programs to manage these resources such as traffic controller, a scheduler, memory management module, input-output programs, and a file system. So, operating system manages computers' basic functions like storing data in the memory, retrieving files from storage devices, scheduling tasks based on priorities. So, you'll find that operating system is that program that is running constantly on your machine and enabling you to interact with machine, bringing you all other utilities, connecting you to the memory of the machine, and enabling you to interact with the machine. That is operating system. So in summary, the boot process can be summarized as we see here. So when you press on your power button, the BIOS carry out a process called post process, which is power on self-test, and it checks. If it doesn't get, like if it gets some of the drivers missing or some of the configurations are not working out, the essential drivers like the RAM, processor, they are missing, it throws for you an error message on the screen. When it checks that everything is in place, then it loads the drivers, the boot driver loads. After the boot driver loads, the bootable media is located. So it searches now the external media that is connected to your computer. This bootable driver here, the MBR, looks for bootable disk. Like if you have a bootable disk that contains the operating system, if it is not there, it throws for you a message that boot program or simply operating system not found. Let us take for example, if you're installing Windows, it will throw for you a message, Windows not found or no bootable device. When it finds, it loads the program. After the program loading, it starts the operating system and your Windows gets installed. Thank you for attending to this session. Next time I invite you, attend again. You're most welcome.